Namaste. So today we decided that we would do a sutta discussion, and thank you, Somnans, for agreeing for that. So I'd just like to introduce everyone to Bhikkhu Asangat and Bhikkhu Sunananda, and අවසරයි ස්වාමීන් වහන්සේ පටන් ගන්න.
Okay. So with the permission from Sunandananda Thero, we can start. And yeah, like you said, so we'll have a sutta discussion, and we sort of discussed with Asita as well about how we should go about it, and we agreed on having a discussion for about 45 minutes or so, and then have if you have any questions that you wanted to ask, you can ask after for the last 15 minutes.
Recording in progress.
So the sutta that I chose today is a sutta called Samyojana Sutta. But before we sort of discuss or go straight into the sutta, we need to there's certain things that we have to sort of understand. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. So because pretty much all the suttas in the Sutta Pitaka, they start with the verses in Pali saying Evang me sutang ekang samyam bhagava. What that means is the translation is thus I have heard, or this was heard by me. And if you don't have the background knowledge of how we got these suttas and why it is in that way that it is, you wouldn't understand what the sutta is talking about, right? So who is this person, and why are we hearing what he has heard, right? You might have these questions if you don't have the background knowledge. So before studying or going into the sutta, we need to first sort of understand that part of Buddhism, right? So at the time that Buddha was living in, after his enlightenment, his cousin, his name was Ananda Thero, he was sort of like the assistant for the Buddha, and one of his duties as the assistant was to remember the Buddha's teachings. So each time the Buddha gave a teaching, he would either listen to the teaching, or Buddha would repeat the teaching to Ananda Thero, and Ananda Thero would remember it and then keep it in his memory. And it is said that he has an exceptional memory. And after the Buddha's passing, there was a question of how it is going to be passed on to future generations. And there were 500, it is said that 500 arahants, or 500 fully enlightened people, they got together after the Buddha's passing, this is. So they got together and they asked Ananda Thero to recite the Dhamma that he has memorized. Right, this is called we call this a first council of Buddhism in the Sasana. And Ananda Thero states that in that council there's 84,000 suttas, right? And he begins to recite one by one. And this is why in the suttas it says Evang me sutang ekang samyam. Evang me sutang, this was heard by me. It's what we call a passive voice sentence, right? Karma karaka vakya. Eva me sutang, this was heard by me. So Ananda Thero is saying, I heard this. And then he goes on to explain what the Buddha said in that sutta. So like I said, there's 84,000 suttas, and these are split into three parts, which we call the Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka. So the Vinaya Pitaka has 21,000 suttas, and that is like the rules for the monks and the nuns. So that's the Vinaya Pitaka. And then we have the Sutta Pitaka. There's also another 21,000 suttas, and that is where pretty much all the suttas are in, meaning that the when you listen to a Dhamma talk or when you read a sutta, you're most of the time you're reading a sutta from the Sutta Pitaka. And like I said, there's 21,000 in there. So 21,000 in the Vinaya Pitaka and 21,000 in the Sutta Pitaka. And that adds up to 42,000. And then the rest, the remaining 42,000 is in the what we call the Abhidhamma Pitaka. And the Abhidhamma Pitaka contains in a lot more detailed explanation about how our mind works. Right? It's more theoretical and goes into specific details about what happens to the mind in any given situation. And there's 42,000 suttas in that. So that's how the 84,000 suttas split up. So there's 21,000 in the Vinaya Pitaka, which is the rules for the monastics. And then the Sutta Pitaka 21,000, and then the Abhidhamma Pitaka 42,000, and there's 84,000 altogether. So at the time, obviously, they didn't have a way to write this down, right? They didn't have 84,000 is a big number, right? So you can't write it down. And so what they did was they would memorize each part and pass it on to the student. So the Vinaya was actually said by a monk named Upali. And Upali Thero was in charge of the Vinaya at the time. And then from Upali Thero, it was passed on to his student, and then from there to his student, etc. So it goes Upali, Dasaka, and then Sonaka, Siggava, Moggali Puttatissa, and then it comes to Sri Lanka. And the Dhamma, on the other hand, was Ananda Thero who was in charge, and then he recited the Dhamma in the first council, and then it was passed on from that teacher to onwards, right? So each group of monks would memorize a certain part of the suttas, and the others would memorize the other parts, etc. And that's how it was passed on from generation to generation, from teacher to student, and from that teacher to student, from that teacher to student. And that's how we have the teachings of the Buddha now, right? So this is what we call the Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka is what we call the Tripitaka, right? Or the three, we call it the three baskets or Pali canon. That is what it is. That is what it consists of. And like I said, most of the Dhamma talks that you hear from monks, and when you listen to a Dhamma talk, it's most likely a sutta from the Sutta Pitaka, right? And for these monks to make it easier for them to memorize, they categorized it according to the length of the sutta. So the longest suttas in the Sutta Pitaka, right? So this is in the Sutta Pitaka. The longest suttas are in what we call the Digha Nikaya. So there's 5 books in the Sutta Pitaka. So first one is Digha Nikaya, which has the longest suttas. And then we have Majjhima Nikaya, which is middle length discourses. And then the third is Samyutta Nikaya. Samyutta means compact, so shorter suttas. And then we have the Anguttara Nikaya and the Kuddaka Nikaya. So we have the long ones, medium, and then the compact ones. And then Anguttara Nikaya is different in the sense that the Anguttara Nikaya has numbered teachings by the Buddha. So from 1 to 11. If Buddha talks about, let's say, 5 things, so Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana. So if Buddha talks about 5 things, these would be in Panchaka Nipata. Or if Buddha talks about 3 things, they would be in the Tikka Nipata, the third one. So that's how Anguttara Nikaya is split into parts. And then we have Kuddaka Nikaya, which is, Kuddaka means sort of like smaller, and has 15 books. It has all the other ones, the Dhammapada or the Thera Theri Gata, Petavattu, Imanavattu, etc. Right? And Sutta Nipata. So those are in the Kuddaka Nikaya. And that's how the Sutta Pitaka is split into parts. So there's 5 books in the Sutta Pitaka: Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, and Kuddaka Nikaya. And so this was done in the first council, where they split these things up. So that was after the Buddha's passing. I think it was about a year or so after the Buddha's passing, or maybe less, these 500 monks got together and decided that they have to do this in order to protect the teachings of the Buddha. And then later, about 100 years later, they had the second council. So they got together again and they recited the Dhamma and the Vinaya. And then I think it was about 500 years later, they had the third council, and etc. And the last council, we've had 6 councils in this sasana so far, and the 6th one, the last one that we've had, that was in Burma in 1950s, mid 1950s, I think. So that was the last or the 6th council in this Buddha sasana. So, like I said, in the Sutta Pitaka, the books are split according to the length of the suttas, right? So Digha Nikaya has the longest suttas. So if someone were to read, let's say, the Sutta Pitaka, it's not something that you can read from front to back and then expect you to understand, or it wouldn't make sense for you to read from front to back, because it's not in any order, it's only in the length of the sutta, right? So in order to understand the suttas, you either have to have a teacher or have some sort of guidance, right? And actually there is this book by Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's called In the Buddha's Words. And what's special about this book is it's a collection of suttas, and Bhikkhu Bodhi has actually compiled the suttas in such a way that you can read from front to back, and it would flow like a story. It would make sense for you to understand. So he has put suttas in an order that you can read from first to the last page, and it would make sense. It's like a story flowing. So it starts off with, for example, the true human conditions, so aging, sickness and death, and then starts from there and then goes all the way to liberation from those 3. So, and he uses the suttas, examples from suttas to make sense of the suttas, right? And it's in a language that you can actually understand, not hard to, it's easy to understand, right? So that's sort of an introduction that I wanted to give before we go into the sutta. And also, having said that, the point of Buddhism or the Buddha's teachings is, not to learn it, right? Not to study it. It is a part of the sasana, right? But normally what happens is, because when you go to school or when you go to uni, normally the person who studies the most, or the person who is the smartest, gets the best grades, right? He becomes the smartest person in the class. But when it comes to spirituality, or when it comes to practicing your spiritual practice, it doesn't matter about how much you know, right? It's not about whether you know all the suttas by heart or not. Even if you don't know any suttas, if you've practiced what your teacher has given, and you use the impermanent nature and the idea of no self, if you've practiced and seen them through yourself, then that person has the ability to be enlightened, or to fully understand their mind. But by reading and memorizing these suttas, that alone by itself is not going to be helpful to you in any way. Otherwise, you have to, what I'm saying is, you have to apply these teachings or the things in the suttas to your life in order to make use of them, right? But and if you can do that, if you can apply the teachings to your life, then you can learn so much and develop so much qualities into your life, right? Because not just by the sutta itself, there's so much going on in the background of these suttas as well. When you find out what goes in that background story and things like that, right? So, and there was this example of a monk named Chula Panthakathero at the time of Buddha. He ordained, and he ordained with his brother, and he was told to memorize a gatha, a stanza, a verse, and he failed to do that. So he's someone who tend to forget things easily. So he couldn't memorize that Dhammapada, that 4-verse gatha. And then he was told to disrobe because he couldn't memorize, he couldn't remember anything. But then Buddha goes to him and gives him something to practice, and he does that, right? And he becomes fully enlightened. he becomes an arahant. So even though he didn't know any suttas or any of the gathas or anything, he was able to be enlightened, right? And personally, I think, when someone learns a lot and studies a lot, they tend to create an ego in themselves. Okay, I know this much, and this person doesn't do this, so I'm better than that person. We create that ego when we learn too much, and that's sort of like a trap that is in this spiritual path that you shouldn't fall into, right? So having said all that, we can, I think, go into the sutta. And there's one more thing that I want to say before we start that sutta as well. In the Sutta Pitaka, in this Tipitaka, so the Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka and the Abhidhamma Pitaka, there are, obviously the majority of it is teachings directly given by the Buddha, which we call Buddha Bhashita, right? But there are also teachings given by disciples of the Buddha or the students of the Buddha, which we call Shravaka Bhashita. Shravaka means student. And this sutta that we are about to discuss is an example of that, right? In this sutta, when we read through this sutta, we'll learn that. So there's Buddha Bhashita and Shravaka Bhashita, right? So if you read the suttas by yourself, you'll come across suttas where Buddha is teaching, or suttas where a student of the Buddha is teaching. And the translation that I'm going to be using for this sutta is by Bhikkhu Sujato. And the sutta is, like I said earlier, is called Samyojana Sutta. Right? Samyojana Sutta, and this is in the Samyutta Nikaya. So remember, in the Sutta Pitaka, we have Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, and Samyutta Nikaya. Samyutta means compact. But don't think that just because it's a shorter sutta or compact sutta, it's not very useful or it's not that deep. Some of the most deepest teachings by the Buddha are actually in this part of the Sutta Pitaka. And this sutta, so it's in the Samyutta Nikaya, and then it's plus in the subsections, right? So this one is in the what we call the Salayatana Vagga. Salayatana means 6 faculties or 6 companies. And what these 6 companies are, or 6 faculties are our senses, right? So we have our 5 senses: eyes, nose, ears, tongue, and our skin. And then Buddha has explained how our brain is also another sense or another faculty. And so for the ear we hear sounds, likewise for the brain we have thoughts, right? So we have eyes, nose, tongue, ear, skin, and then the brain. So these are the 6 faculties of Salayatana, as Buddha says, that Buddha talks about. So this sutta is in Samyutta Nikaya. It's a shorter sutta, and then it's in the Salayatana Vagga. So it has suttas about our senses. So what we can see from this so far is that, like I've been saying in our programs on Sundays, is that Buddha's teachings is about understanding ourselves, right? It's about understanding how our body and our mind works, and it's a way to develop ourselves, or it's a technique for self-development. And so if you go to the sutta, it starts off with Ekang Samyang Sambahula Tera, right? So in this sutta, it doesn't actually start with Evam Me Sutang. But if you go to the start of the Vagga, Salayatana Vagga, it actually starts off with Evam Me Sutang Ekang Samyam Bhagava Savatya Miharati, etc. But because it gets repeated in the other suttas, that part is only in the first sutta, and you have to understand that part is also included in this sutta. So then Ananda Thera goes Ekang Samyan Sambahula Thera Bhikkhu. So in the translation, it says, and at one time several senior mendicants were staying near this place. So Sambahula actually means many. So in the translation it says several, but Sambahula means many, right? Many senior monks. It shows where they says where they're staying at. and then after their meal they got together in the meeting room, and then they started discussing the Dhamma. Right? So, and there was this question. They had two words, and they wanted to know if the meaning of these two words are the same or are they different. So the first word is Samyojana, or feta, or attachment. And the second is Samyojaniya Dhamma. Samyojaniya Dhamma. Or in English we say things prone to being fettered, or things prone to being attached, you can say. Right? So these monks, these senior monks, they wanted to know if these two have the same meaning or are they different. Right? And it says obviously they're different in phrasing, right? So we don't need to talk about that. They're two different phrasings. But the meaning itself, one group of monks said that the meaning of these two words, Samyojaniya and Samyojaniya Dhamma, these two are the same. And the other group of monks, they said that these two words, they have different meanings. So one said they're the same meaning, then the other said they're different meanings. And they wanted to come to a conclusion on which one is right. And then the sutta says, a person named Chitta, householder named Chitta, had arrived at that city where the monks are, and he heard about this discussion and the confusion that came across. And this person Chitta, he's obviously, it says householder, so he's a lay person, and it is said that he's what we call a non-returner, or someone who has practiced mindfulness and progressed very, very far. He's very advanced in his practice. And the word non-returner, it means, in Pali we say anagami. What that means is, normally a human person, they live pleasing their senses, right? That's what they live for. They want to please their eyes, they want to please their ears, the tongue, the nose, the skin. They want to please these things, and that's what they live for. But someone who is an anagami is someone who has overcome that and gotten rid of those that needing to please the senses all the time. So such a person, when they practice mindfulness, they come to a stage where they no longer are attached to these senses, right? Or in other words, attached to the body. So this person Chitta is such a person, right? And so far we can learn a lot from this part, right? Normally people think that in order to practice the Buddha's teachings we need to live in a monastery, or we need to be a monk, right? But here it gives an example of a lay person who is doing a normal job, living a normal life, but has progressed so much that further than those monks who were senior monks, right? And there's the other part also, which is these monks, senior monks, who are willing to listen to Chitta, right? So they were having this discussion and they needed an answer to this question that came up. And one group was saying these two words mean the same thing, the other group was saying these mean different meanings. They wanted to know what is the truth, right? They don't care about who is right and who is wrong. These monks just wanted to know the truth. And they were open-minded enough to listen to Chitta, a layperson who knew the answer to this. Right? And this is a quality that any truth seeker, or someone who is seeking liberation, someone who is seeking the truth, we can say Satchagavis in Pali, someone who is seeking the truth, this is a quality that they must have. And this is shown in a lot of other suttas as well. For example, Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, and there's a story called the Hamsota Jataka, right, where a king lets go of his kingdom and then goes search for the Dhamma. So he lets go of everything that he has in his possession, and he goes searching for the Dhamma. And he asks people, and nobody knows the Dhamma. until he meets a devil, right? And this devil says, I know the Dhamma. And then the king says, okay, teach me. And then he says, no, I need something in return. And then the king says, I've given up everything. I don't have any power, I don't have any wealth, I only have my life. And then the devil says, okay, give me your life, and then I'll give you the Dhamma. And this has a very deep meaning, right? So in one meaning, or in one interpretation, or in one case, we have the king listening to the Dhamma from a devil. So the king would never have thought that he would have to hear the Dhamma from a devil, right? But he was open-minded enough to listen to what the devil had to say. And secondly, the king had let go of all his materialistic possessions in order to hear the Dhamma. And at the end, he had to let go of the attachment that he has to his life in order to listen to the Dhamma, right? So here also we see these monks where they are listening to a layperson and asking them to clarify this confusion. So then it goes and you know, you can apply this to yourself as well, right? Sometimes people think that a monk who knows all the suttas of by heart is someone who knows the Dhamma, or someone who meditates 8 hours a day is the one who knows the Dhamma. And we have these different views. And then we go searching for such a person who meets these requirements that we have, right? And along the way we meet people who would know the Dhamma, who are willing to teach us the Dhamma, but because we are only searching for that group of people, we miss out on those teachers who are teaching us these, who are willing to teach us, right? And we miss out on their blessings. So it's very important as someone who is practicing mindfulness or practicing trying to seek the truth, to have an open mind and is willing to listen to anyone, right? Because most of the time the teacher that you get is someone that you don't expect, right? It could be a friend of yours, could be an enemy of yours, could be someone younger than you, could be someone completely different. Someone you would least expect to know the Dhamma might actually know the Dhamma. So if you're not open-minded enough to listen to them, you miss out on what they have to teach, right? So in this case, so Chitta goes to these monks and asks, tells these monks that he heard about this discussion and asks, did you have this discussion? And then the monk says, okay, that's right, we did have it. And then so this household Chitta goes, the Samyojana and the Samyojaniya Dhamma, they differ in both the meaning and also phrasing. So like I said, the phrasing is obviously different, right? It's a meaning that we have to discuss here. So Chitta says that these are two different, they have different meanings. And then to understand this better, he gives a simile. And this is something that we see quite a lot in the suttas, where even Buddha gives a simile in order for us to understand this better, right? And in this case, Chitta gives a simile and he says, suppose there was a black ox. There's a black ox and a white ox. So there's a black ox and a white ox, and they're tied by a harness or a yoke, right? So let's say a rope or a harness, they're tied together. And then he asks the monks, would it be right to say that the black ox is the yoke of the white ox? Or in other words, the black ox is the attachment of the white ox, and vice versa. Is the white ox the attachment of the black ox? And then the monks say that that's wrong, right? That's wrong. And he says, the monks say that the black ox is not the yoke of the white ox, and the white ox is not the yoke of the black ox. The yoke is the harness, right? They're tied together by the harness that is in the middle, or the rope that is in the middle. And then the Chitta says, in the same way, the eye is not the attachment of the sights, and the things that we see are not the attachment of the eye. And it's the same for all our other senses as well. So our ears are not the attachment of the things that we hear, and the things that we hear are not the attachment of the ear. Same with the tongue, right? So the things that we taste are not the attachment, and the tongue is not the attachment of the taste. The attachment here is the desires or the cravings or the greed that develops within us. Right? So what that means is, and Chitta says here, right? So he says, the fetter there is the desire and the greed that arises from the pair of them. So because of the sounds and the ear, because of them, we get desires and greed and things like that. And it works both ways, right? So remember these things. When we explain it, or when we listen to the Dhamma like that, we think, okay, maybe if I don't listen to any sounds, or maybe if I don't listen to any music, then I can get rid of the desires, because of the sounds and the ear, that's why we get desires, right? So if I get rid of the sounds and the desires, sounds and the ear, then I don't have desires. But that's not the case here, right? Because these two things, the ear and the sounds, they are Samyojaniya Dhamma, right? They are not the Samyojana, or in other words, these two things arise the desires within us. They themselves are not the desires. They themselves are not the problem here. The problem here is the desires that arises within us, right? And the reason that we get Samyojana, or the reason that these desires arise within us, is because as soon as we hear something, we take these things to be permanent, right? Remember how I said, when something touches me, I notice that. But when I let go, or when that thing stops touching me, I don't notice that, because at that very instant my mind is focusing on something else. So as soon as I touch something, I notice that, and then I don't notice the letting go part, which means I only notice half of that experience, right? I notice the arising, but not the cessation part. When you understand the cessation part as well, then you experience the full experience, the full experience, right? When you only see the arising part, you only notice half of that experience. So in this case, we say the sensation that and the skin that touches, these two things are Samyojaniya Dhamma. They cause desires to arise, but they themselves are not the desires. They themselves are not the attachment, right? They themselves are not the problem here. And if we look at it the other way, the Samyojana, the desires, they don't arise without these two things. Without the Samyojaniya Dhamma, the desires don't arise either. So it's very subtle, right? So you need both of these things, and they're what we call dependent arising, right? They're dependent on each other. If one of them falls, the other falls as well. And so the goal here is to understand the nature of desires, right? Which is when you practice mindfulness, when you observe how these things are rising and going away, you're not being persuaded by these desires anymore. You don't give a value to these desires anymore, or you don't give a meaning to these things anymore, and you're experiencing the full nature of this, right? So the beginning, the middle, and the end. And because of that, you understand that these things are impermanent, right? The reason that desires and things like that arises is because we find that, like I said earlier, we consider them to be permanent. We consider them to be something that is long lasting, right? And if you think deeply about this as well, you can sort of understand, if you think about it, this person who is experiencing these things, when did he arise? Or when was he created? Was he there the whole time, or did he arise as these desires arise? Right? Think about it, right? So I hear a sound, and as with that sound, because I'm attached, these desires are arising, these attachments are arising, there's a person who hears this sound as well. Right? So if this, in other words, if these Samyojaniya Dhamma, let's say the six senses are not there, can you say who you are? Can you explain to me in any way who you are without these six senses? We can't, right? We need something, a Samyojaniya Dhamma. We need an experience, external or internal, for me to exist, for this person to exist. So this idea of a self also arises because of this Samyojaniya Dhamma. And without them without that attachment also, we can't consider, or we don't have this idea of a self. So not just impermanent self, impermanent things, but also we find that this idea of a self also is created because of is also a Samyojan itself, and is also created because of this of the Samyojaniya Dhamma, right? So Samyojaniya Dhamma, like I said, is the things that are causing or prone to being fettered. They themselves are not the desires or the attachment. The attachment is something that occurs within us. The other things only help arises the desires, right? And then the monks sort of like thank the chitta householder and saying that you're very fortunate to traverse the Buddha's deep teachings with the eye of the wisdom. And the sutta ends there. So if you think about, let's take a step back, right? If you think about a normal person's life, they're doing a job, they're studying hard and going on road trips and things like that. In their life, we have a saying in Buddhism, we say dullabhang saddhamma savana. What that means is to hear the Dhamma is a very rare opportunity, right? Normally a person is so occupied in their life that they say, okay, I'm too busy to listen to a Dhamma talk, or I'm too busy to practice the Dhamma, and they go on their life without even hearing about this illusion that their mind is creating. So for them, what they're experiencing is true, is real, right? So all their life they live thinking that these things are meaningful, right? They are meaningful in that instance, but in long term they don't mean anything, right? So maybe it's your career, maybe it's wealth, maybe it's the power that you have, right? Whatever it is, they're only meaningful or useful in a very limited space and time, right? If something is real, it has to be real for everyone. It has to be the same for everyone, right? I used that term truth seeker earlier, and what that means is, in other words, the things that we experience are not true. Does that make sense? Because if these are true, then we don't need to seek the truth. But the things that we experience through our senses are relative to each other. So what I experience is relative to me, and what someone else experiences is relative to them, right? And this is why certain people like certain things and other people dislike that same thing, right? So some person might like durian and the other person might hate durian, and that occurs because these things are relative to each other. And if something is relative, if something is one thing to me and a different thing to someone else, then it can't be true, right? If it's true, it has to be the same for everyone, right? So these things are what we call Samyojana, which means attachments. They depend on the concepts that we have attachments to, our desires, right? That's why we have certain people like a certain thing and the other people dislike. It's because everyone's Samyojana, or the desires that they have, are different. But the external thing is the same. They're the ones causing the Samyojana, or they're the ones what we call Samyojaniya Dhamma, prone to being fettered. But they themselves are not the Samyojana, or the attachments. So let me have another 15 minutes. So like I said, people go on their life and not hear this teaching by the Buddha all their life, right? And if you think about that, to be a human being, it's very special, right? We can think more, we can understand more, we can talk. Right? I can't teach this to a dog or any other animals, right? I can teach it to another human, but not to any other animal. So we have this special ability to understand our mind, to talk about the mind, and then you can practice it and see if it is true or not yourself, to verify it yourself, right? So when you practice it yourself, you can sort of be confident about the teachings of the Buddha. And what that means is, a lot of people sort of waste this opportunity that they have gotten. But if there's a wise person, Buddha says they practice this, and before they know it, they realize it, right? So I think that's what I wanted to talk about in this sutta. And the sutta, like I said, is called the Samyojana Sutta. And if anyone has any questions that they want to ask, they are free to ask.
Everyone can unmute themselves. There's no restrictions or anything. If you have any question, you can unmute yourself and ask. I will ask a question, but just to complete that story you mentioned about the Hamsala. So that king was asked to give his life to listen to Dhamma. So what happened after that?
What happened after that?
Yeah. So if he gave his life,
he won't
be able to listen to Dhamma, right?
So what happens is the king tells the devil to go to the bottom of a cliff, and the king jumps off the cliff, and while he's in the air, the devil tells the Dhamma. But what it's saying, it's a deeper meaning, right? So like I said, he first has to, he lets go of his kingdom and the power and everything that he had, right? And whether it is materialistically or not doesn't matter, right? It's a mental attachment. He has to get rid of that. And then the last attachment that anyone has is the attachment to their life, right? And so in this case, in order to listen to the Dhamma, in order to hear the Dhamma, he has to get rid of that attachment as well, that final attachment. And that's when he understands the Dhamma. And by the death, what that symbolizes is that he becomes fully enlightened, right? Because at the end of this, is what happens is you realize that there is no self here. There's a book by Eckhart Tolle. I think it was in the book The Power of Now. There's a quote in that book. It says, the aim of life, the purpose of life is to die before death, and to find that there is no death. So what that means is you have to find out that this idea of death is only created if there is a person here. There's a person to die. If there is no person to die, if you realize that there is no person to die, then you realize that there is no death. And what that implies is that there was no birth either. But this is I think deep, right? But that's sort of the deep end of the pool. But yeah, and what I wanted to show in that Dhammsutta Jataka is that the devil is someone, the one who teaches you the Dhamma is someone that you least expect, right? Because we have views on who might know the Dhamma, right? So for example, in that idea of, if someone has the idea that someone who meditates 8 hours a day is the person who knows the Dhamma, and he's so attached to that view, attached to that concept, then that person goes around looking for someone meditating 8 hours a day. But teachers come to him who don't meditate 8 hours a day but actually know the Dhamma. But this person is not open-minded enough to listen to that person, and they miss out on that person, right? So it's very important to be open-minded, because you never know. Yeah. So Nasa, do you want to add anything? Wait, Sona's not even in Ripplebrook. Where are you? Didn't even see you this whole day.
Oh, I'm at Dhammasana temple.
Oh.
You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
We just travel to somewhere. Yeah, it's Philips Island. So just go there and came back. So I think it's very good that from the beginning explaining about Sutta Pitaka, briefing how to learn Sutta Pitaka or understand Sutta Pitaka. I think that is very important. And also, regarding the question Asita asked, I think I would like to add, just fine tune, maybe, when he is able to let go of the life, that itself is Dhamma. I think Asankata explained it. There's no Dhamma separate from that letting go of the craving of the life. So that itself is Dhamma. So maybe there's nothing to be, maybe if he has something to tell, then that is just, you have just let go of your craving. Maybe that is what he has to hear, if something need to be heard. I mean, this is what I wanted to teach you. Just letting go of the life. Craving to oneself or craving to the life. So, he bring to a point that he really experienced the letting go. Create a situation. So that is something practical. That is not something intellectually understanding. You really bring to that point of experience, really experience it. So this is the difference between understanding something intellectually and experience it really, facing the experience. So, Venerable Asankata explained it at the beginning of this speech, that reading the sutta and understanding it intellectually is different from real understanding. Real understanding means you really experience it. It's like you feel it, you touch it. So, to understand this kind of knowledge, we need to listen to it first, of course. We need to understand it intellectually, as well as we need to practice also. That is where the mindfulness comes, mindfulness practice comes. So, as Venerable Asankata said, when you don't have any sensual experiences, then you cannot explain yourself. So when we practice also, we stay away from worldly experiences, worldly relationships, and limit our experience to maybe our body experience, or just simple listening, or simply seeing. So we limit our experiences. So when we limit our experience, we can experience how craving reduce in ourselves, craving or attachment being reduced in ourselves, and we also can experience it. We also can feel it. That feeling of reducing attachment is not something intellectual. So we can experience, we can feel it. So feeling is very important. Touching that experience, and then when you go back to early experience, you can see how this attachment arises again, and how you experience your world and yourself differently than when you stay with these limited experiences. When you stay with this limited, simple experience, when you stay with your body experience, you experience yourself and the world differently than when you deal with complex situations. So this is something you can really feel or touch even within your bodily sensations. When you have a difficult or complex experience, even your bodily sensations start to change, right? So this is something you can experience through your body. So that is the difference. Like the Hamsonda, when he decided to suicide, he might be able to experience it through his body and mind and everything, the whole world. So this experience is the most important. How to deal with this kind of experience and understand. So this is the difference between we understand something intellectually or theoretically, and we understand something more profoundly. So that complete understanding is what's so-called wisdom when come to the practice, Buddhist practice. So that is, I think, that's enough. Then I think, we can, we can listen to their ideas also. Because even here in the sutta also, citta is explained in Dhamma, right? So there's no difference between monks and lay people. Monks also can learn from lay people, children or youth like you, because we are from different backgrounds and different set of experience. Of course, we all have to. There are things we can learn from each other. So yeah.
Samse mentioned the repeatedly the feeling of reducing attachment. Is there a set of points or something that is there something what would reducing attachment look like or feel like? I don't know if that question makes sense.
It does. So when it comes to attachments, Buddha doesn't talk about physically losing them, right? That's not the getting rid of attachment that Buddha talks about. The Buddha talks about the mental attachment, right? And the way or the technique that we use in order to do that is mindfulness, right? Because the reason that these attachments are created is because we have wrong views about these things, right? About these six senses and also the things that these six senses focus on. And those wrong views, Buddha says, are taking things to be permanent, taking things to be sukha, or what's the word? Yeah, sukha, and also atma. Atma means there's a person, or this can be mine. That sort of view. So because of these wrong views, Buddha says that our mind naturally thinks that there's desires, and because of these wrong views, there's also I can own these things. And that's how these attachments arise. But when we are mindful, what we observe is that these things are the opposite of those, which means they're impermanent and there's nothing to be taken as sukha, and also there's no self here. And that is the way we don't forcefully forget about things or materialistically lose things. It's a matter of practicing mindfulness and understanding the true nature of these things, right? And what you learn from that is that there's nothing to be attached to, right? So it's not that these things exist and I'm getting attached or I'm not getting attached. You learn that there's actually these things are given meanings through myself, right? Does that make sense? I'm the one giving meaning to these things, and without that meaning, or without giving that, when you practice mindfulness, what you learn is there's nothing to be giving meaning to. These are just that doesn't mean that they don't exist or anything. It just means that it's that what we call trilakshana, right? Impermanent, dukkha, and anatma.
So just because you care about something less, it doesn't mean I'm reducing my attachment. I have to understand the nature that you're saying.
I mean, let's say, can you give me an example?
I just think about say an argument I have with someone on the daily.
No, here's the thing, right? So you could forget about the argument, but if you in your mind, if you're thinking about it, I should have said this, or I shouldn't have said this. If you keep thinking about it, that means you're still attached to it, right?
Yeah. So what if? Yeah. Sorry. Continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So and at the same time, there are instances where you can just like you said, just not care about it and move on.
Yeah.
But in those times, that would mean that it is helping you to understand the nature of that, because you're not too attached to that view that you have in your mind, right? The reason that we argue is because I have a view in my mind and I want to prove it right to the other person.
Yeah.
And when you're moving on, like really moving on, not thinking about it later, it means that you're not attached to that view that you have within you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it just depends on the context, right? Like if you don't study for your uni or something, not care about your uni degree, doesn't mean you're not attached to it, right? You need to do these things to live a lay life, right? You can't not do the work that you have at your job, saying that you're getting rid of your attachments. Right. Yeah. So if no one else has a question, we can probably end.